Namaste, greetings from the Chanakya University, Bengaluru. Welcome to one and all. I acknowledge the presence of the leadership team at the Chanakya University, Honorable Chancellor Sir, Pro-Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, Registrars, Deans and the entire family of the Chanakya University. It is my pleasure to welcome distinguished guests. We have amidst us Padma Shri Mohandas Pai Sir, also a member of the Board of Governors of Chanakya University, and Shri Gopal Hosur Sir, a distinguished police personnel that we all know. Without further ado, I request our Vice Chancellor Sir to welcome the Chief Guest and the presence of the other two members of our support team for this talk amidst us. Thank you. Welcome, youths.
A very good morning and a very warm welcome to this special lecture that all of us are going to enjoy today. Chanakya University, as many of you may be well aware of, is a new university which has been just 1 year old. We started as a state private university last year. Our first batch of students are currently have just completed the year 1 and we are moving on to the year 2. We are located very close to the airport near Devanahalli, and as a university which has a stated objective of both producing knowledge and also producing transformative leaders, we thought it's extremely important that we get into dialogues, we get into know newer things and debate on the newer things. This is one of the reasons why Chanakya University started a series of lectures from distinguished scholars. Last year, in our year 1, we started a series called India at 75. We did 75 different activities that included series of lectures. This year, again, we started most importantly with a kind of discussion-centered lecture series. I am sure many of you would have seen. The latest one was just a week ago by Vivek Debroy, who spoke about the current status of Indian economy. And today we have with us Shri M.J. Akbar. I'm sure only the name will do. We don't have to say many more, though of course I would be requesting my colleagues to also speak a few things about him later to introduce him. As a journalist, author, and also I think as a minister, we all know M.J. Akbar. And it's our great fortune that he agreed to be here and also to deliver a lecture. On behalf of Chanakya University and on behalf of all of you, I extend a very warm welcome to Shri M.J. Akbar. We also have with us today, with me today on the dais, two young representatives. We have actually partnered with these two organizations for doing this event. The World Organization for Students, Youth, and Amulya represent this organization. A very warm welcome to you. And also the Kintalks and Praveen represents this organization. A very warm welcome to you. We have our Chancellor, Professor M.K. Sridhar with us, our Pro-Chancellor, Mr. M.P. Kumar, our Chief Operating Officer, Mr. Nagaraj Reddy. We also have very distinguished people here. We have the member of our Board of Governors, Shri Mohandas Pai. We have Shri Gopal. A host of you, of course, there are many of you, I'm sure, very distinguished people. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Let's all join together and listen to M.J. Akbar and also get into some kind of a dialogue on a very important topic, the war and its impact. I think is the center of all the discussion that we are going to have, and I look forward to that as well. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir. I think we are all here eagerly waiting to listen to Shri M.J. Akbar, sir. Most of us know him. For those who are trying to understand his work, which is quite deep in terms of its impact, I would like to introduce him very briefly. There's a long and illustrious profile. As we all know, Sir Shri M.J. Akbar, sir, is a former Minister of State for External Affairs, Government of India. He has served as Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, Sir is also had an illustrious career as a journalist and editor. Also, most importantly, his work, especially India, the Siege Within, Nehru, the Making of India, Kashmir, Behind the Veil, The Shade of Swords, Jihad, and the conflict between Islam and Christianity, Tinderbox, The Past and Future of Pakistan, and Blood Brothers, a novel. In addition to these, there have been 4 collections of his columns, reportage, and essays. His books have been translated into many languages. His contribution to the contemporary debate has been widely acknowledged, as we all acknowledge the same too. In 2004, he was named a member of Forum of Islamic Scholars and Intellectuals set up by Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah to draft a 10-year charter for Muslim nations at a special conference in Mecca. In March 2006, Sir joined the Brookings Institution in Washington as a visiting fellow in the Brookings Project on U.S. policy towards Islamic world. He also serves as chairman of the Trust for Kolkata Muslim Orphanage. Sir M.J. Akbar ji has also had an illustrious career, as I mentioned, as journalist and editor. In 1976, he launched as editor India's first weekly political news magazine, Sunday, which quickly became a household presence. He started 2 daily newspapers, The Telegraph in 1982 and The Asian Age in 1994. He has served as editorial director of India Today, Headlines Today, and editor of the Deccan Chronicle and the Sunday Guardian. Sir entered public life in 1989 when he was elected as Lok Sabha from Kishanganj, Bihar. He went back to media in 1993 and returned to public life in March 2014 when he joined the BJP and became the party's national spokesperson. He was elected MP to the Rajya Sabha from Jharkhand as well as from Madhya Pradesh. Without further ado, I now request Sir to address the gathering. A lot of young minds are waiting for your insights, sir. Over to you, sir.
Friends and friends who have had the vision, courage, and sheer dedication to start what I am certain will be another great intellectual pillar which shapes or which contributes to the shaping of the next 30 years of our country's future, if not much longer, which is Chanakya University. In particular, friends like Mohan, who has actually, one has over these years, one of the good things about journalism is that you never actually make much money yourself, but you watch a lot of people making money. And most of them, the money becomes a kind of mysterious private presence, right? But people like him who have actually, given back to society much more, I would say, than they have taken from it. I mean, they are rare. They are rare and we should honor them. And it's also, I tell you, one of the very important developments which the young scholars may like to register, or even the middle-aged scholars might like to register. One of the great things that I have seen in the last 30 years, Mohan has seen, all of us seen, is education being rescued from the state monopoly. I don't decry what the state has done, but the state has limitations. And one of the great limitations of the state is intellectual stagnation. This kind of renaissance of education and, the regeneration of knowledge that has been brought about by one of the greatest reforms of free India, which is educational reform, is something that we now take for granted. We shouldn't. We should recognize, and each new stone laid upon another new edifice of education does far more to create the future that we dream of than perhaps any other endeavor. I was born and come from a state that is the only state I know of, if I am wrong, please correct me, whose three real deities are all women: Durga, Kali, and very often forgotten Saraswati. And I think the culture of Goddess Saraswati is being brought to the forefront by the private sector in a way that will be recorded by our history as one of the vital contributions to our future. Let me turn now to the subject that I think will or should interest you. But let me begin with a question that you might think a little odd. When does a century begin? Does a century begin if every century began only from the calendar as determined by the Georgians or the Julians or by anyone else? Then there would be no story to tell. At least I would not have begun this discourse with it. But century is not determined by the calendar. A century is determined by the seminal event which shapes the century. And therefore the 20th century, in my view, really began with 1914. The period before 1914 was the long 19th century. But the 20th century also ended in 1990, making it a short century. Or, if we want to extend this, it ended in 2001, making it a short century. And here I hope to explain how precisely, what precisely do I mean when I say this. 1914, 1918, 1919 saw three very great, once again, events which shaped the forthcoming decades. In exactly the same year that Gandhiji was facing a court after his work in Champaran, in exactly the same year, Lenin was taking over power in Leningrad and Moscow. So Lenin and Gandhi, in political terms, are almost exact contemporaries. The third thing happened in 1917, 1918. For the first time, the United States became a rising power of the changing international order with its participation in World War I. Now, its participation in World War I is not the story, but the fact that its participation was decisive is the story, because the side which it took, which is then the Anglo-American axis, it played a decisive role in victory and therefore in shaping what was going to happen next. In terms of what the Lenin achieved, Lenin and after him Stalin, they achieved revolution. But this revolution was accompanied very unusually by retreat. They retreated from the First World War. So they retreated from the First World War, which was perhaps the last truly imperial war, saying that this is a war of the ruling classes and we have no place in it. But they set in motion a second war, which is the war of revolutions, which caught hold of the imagination of the generation in many ways. There was first the direct control of those who believed implicitly in violence as the only vehicle for change. Then there were others who were influenced by the parallel idea. The parallel idea, the champion of that parallel idea was Mahatma Gandhi, who said that change is more effective through non-violence. Now, this may not seem obvious, And I obviously, or equally obviously, I cannot, this is not the theme of my subject, so I can't dilate upon it more than just, coming to a few sentences to explain what I am saying. And which is that if you look at it, the record, Lenin's experiment with violence collapsed by 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the change that he initiated had very great success. As I said, it became a rising fact. It became by Yalta a major superpower in the world after the end of the Second World War. But it was brittle. There was the fact that it was only a pretend democracy or a revolution in the name of the people without the participation of the people, eventually led to its collapse and led. On the other hand, the Gandhian model, if not Gandhianism, and the Gandhian model may have other aspects to it. I mean, in other countries, it may be called the democratic model also, equally correctly. But this model that you can create change, end serfdom, end feudalism, end all the evils, and there are many social evils, particularly in our country, without necessarily killing the evildoer or the historic evildoer. How to create change by mutual acceptance that the past is no longer valid. Okay, you may have been a zamidar in the past, you may have been a maharaja in the past, you may have been a nawab in the past, you may have had this kind of wealth in the past, but it is no longer valid as a form of for the sustainable future. That era is gone. Therefore, you have a place, but it is now a place within the more even culture of democratic behavior. I have not said equality because it doesn't happen, but in the more even culture of democratic behavior. Impact of 1990 is something that we will deal with, but I do want to just quickly mention in the past, because we have to, if we are going to discuss the Ukraine war, we must understand that the Ukraine war is a direct consequence of 1990. Without that, 1990 happens. So what happens with Moscow and Russia in 1990? In 1990, between 1979, which is the invasion, the last gasp, they say the candle is always at its brightest before it collapses. So the last gasp of Russian imperialism, or communist imperialism, was Afghanistan. The communist invasion of Afghanistan, 1979, had its consequences. All of you are familiar with it. And by 1990, it led directly or indirectly through mistakes made by Gorbachev. If Mohan promises to invite me again, and I have my doubts which he will do so, but I am ready to come here and give a very, very speculative lecture on whether Imran Khan is Pakistan's Gorbachev. But that is for another day. But along with the misunderstandings and, that also reminds me, which I can't resist telling you, the greatest danger before any political leader is to have your photograph on the cover of Time magazine. Nobody ever recovers from that. So, the Gorbachev got it 3 or 4 times, and that was the end of the Soviet Union. But on a more serious note, after 1990, Russia became what I call a nervous power. Russia was still powerful. You cannot have 5,000 or 6,000 nuclear weapons. You cannot have that kind of sophisticated technology which we are seeing. They still have it, by the way. Right? And so on. In fact, the derivative question that is again a subject for further inquiry separately, but on a parallel path, is whether Russia, in historical terms, is more powerful as an empire, which is as a Tsarist power, or whether Russia is more powerful as a nation. That is yet another subject that should excite inquiry. And since we are sitting in the midst of scholars and of your university, sir, I think these are some of the subjects that you might encourage your young people to, pursue. So it became a nervous power, and its whole strategy after that, and this is a mark of nervousness, which didn't exist because the borders of the Soviet Union, therefore of Russia as a superpower, were clearly defined. And if anyone didn't know the definition, they built a wall in Berlin to define it. But it was the Warsaw Pact. Just as in Europe, the Americans laid the NATO Pact. So those were recognized borders. The recognition of borders is very fundamental to the stability of our era and our times. Borders may or may not be absolute, but the recognition means that we have set the limits of our strategic ambitions. And unless we set the limits of our strategic ambitions, there cannot be the understanding which leads to, well, you don't want to call it peace, call it a truce. But certainly, which within a generation or two generations, ensures that a cold war remains cold. It doesn't become hot. Right? Now, since 1990, the Russian policy and objective has been the search for a new definition of its border. Instead of using the opportunity, the greatest, I tell you historically, we can almost take any instance. The greatest and most dangerous mistakes that are made at the end of a war is not by those who have lost, but by those who have won. Because they do not know how to define victory. America, instead of learning how to define victory, fell into the ultimate trap, which is the trap of triumphalism. And all through 1990s was controlled because our academic and our thinking is controlled by what is produced, by schools which were actually created out of slave trade. Yale. And since I mentioned Yale, because Yale was created out of the slave trade in your neighborhood, Chennai. Yale is the name of the governor, East India governor of that time, who quietly took his money and gave a donation. And that's why they liked the money so much, they've still kept that name. So, but this triumphalism was then converted into doctrine. The end of history. Francis Fukuyama. The end of history, which means history has now ceased and the future will be only defined by our preferred system of polity, which is quote-unquote liberal democracy. And if I put liberal democracy under quote-unquote, I put liberal under 4 quotation marks. Right? Because your meaning of liberal may be quite different from my meaning of liberal. But that template, that model of liberal democracy now has become the defining fact of history, and this is what is going to control the next century. As it happened, this exploded in 10 years. The American triumphalism was brought down by the Twin Towers. And Twin Towers took them into Afghanistan. Twin Towers then, because we must always read carefully the small print. The Bush Doctrine. This is triumphalism. The Bush Doctrine that America reserves the right to intervene wherever it perceives a threat. Not wherever there is a threat, wherever it perceives a threat. So, it takes you to Iraq, 2004. By 2008, America has become a nervous power. And what evidence do I have for that? Look, somebody will eventually sort of write the story of Obama years. And during the Obama years, America in strategic terms was benumbed, as if it did not have the ability to move. So you watched while Putin, Russia, advanced to the edge of the Black Sea and from there to control of Marmara in Crimea. And you watched as the whole strategic reality of West Asia was changed by the war for Syria. And how there was complete. Actually, America abandoned its traditional spaces of influence in order to reach accommodation, leading again to perhaps estimation and overestimation. I am not here to judge, nor should we attempt judging, but the fact remains that the one thing leads to the next, right? And maybe the Russian success in these areas persuaded Putin that he could now take. The difference between success and failure, friends, is the difference between a step and a misstep. So, whether it was a misstep, and irrespective of how the Ukraine war ends, and it will not end the way NATO wants it to end. I don't believe it, at least. I can't predict, but I don't believe it. It will end with some pause in the Russian advance. I don't think the Russians will go back to the original border. There may be no recognition of the advance, but that's eventually de facto becomes de jure. And but what it has done already is that it has ended the Kissinger formula for what might be described, because he was the biggest advocate of it, and he was a very brilliant man, absolutely no doubt about it, but proving once again that brilliant men can be wrong. So, the Kissinger formula, where he revived the oldest rule in the book, balance of power. And the balance of power has been now severely dislocated. In fact, one of my subsidiary arguments, and I have the freedom to say so because nobody will listen. So it makes no difference. However, I have long argued that we in India have real capacity to lead the world in an alternative to the balance of power, because our thinking, our behavior, and our foreign policy has built, and now I think it is going even a step further, on the power of balance. And if we pursue this doctrine of the power of balance, we will not only be doing ourselves great good, but doing the world great good. Among the consequences of the destruction of balance of power, you see, the 20th century period of Cold War, and when we talked of comparative peace, it was created not simply by the two superpowers, but it was created also by two clusters of what I call the obedient powers. Obedient powers. So within the American zone of influence, when push came to shove, if ever, then West Asia's primary powers, Europe, and those parts which controlled, understood that they had no option except obedience to America. Similarly, the Russians, their Warsaw Pact countries or their zones of influence, that if it came to, there may be very variations on the way and many shades, but when it came to a crux, they had no option except obedience to Moscow. So these were the obedient powers. Two countries which remained outside the matrix, outside this matrix, were India and China. We were never really obedient to what might be called the natural arc of our gravitation. The natural arc of our gravitation would be democracies. But we always exercised strategic autonomy. And to its credit, China also exercised strategic autonomy. Didn't allow communism or the Comintern, rejected the Comintern. Comintern was the vehicle of obedience. And China rejected it under Mao. So, therefore, creating space, and I think this is reason why there was opportunity that was created. Now, who will take advantage of the opportunity, how far, is now a work in progress. But certainly the two, they were, smaller obedient powers. Vietnam was there, and so on, so forth, right? But one of the things we are already experiencing is that the desire for strategic autonomy is very infectious. And we are already seeing it now in Saudi Arabia. But let me now, before I get to the next stage, remind you of one of the, of course, whenever you forget who said what, you can always name it to Churchill, Lenin, Marx or Shakespeare. And you will more often get it right. We don't know enough about Chanakya, right? Otherwise you could have included Chanakya also. Chanakya, Suzu, and you got it. Somewhere within these people. But this quote of Lenin is really very important. Is that sometimes nothing happens for decades, and then decades happen within weeks. Or centuries happen within weeks. And certainly in 1917, beginning of World War, centuries happened, or at least one century happened within weeks. I said that because eventually, I will connect this to a quote by Xi Jinping during his last visit to Moscow, but I'll first bore you with something a bit longer. Clearly, we are going through a Lenin cycle now. The exact quote is that, anyway, it's long. So the time has come to pick up the mirror and reflect upon the future. And see how the evolution of the next decade, which will be our immediate horizon. A decade may be a long time for me, right? And a long time to the elderly. But for the young, a decade is, a minute. So it's a very realistic horizon through which a decade is only tomorrow. Why did I position this essay as the European war with Asian consequences? To begin with, you have to understand Russia. Russia has 11 time zones. Only 1.5 are in Europe. Only 1.5. There are 2 or 3 patches which enter a different, but in real terms, Europe is one time zone. And then now imagine how vast. Russia is not it is a European country, but it is a nation state. And therefore, the geography of Russia is something that has been buried under the avalanche of the politics of Russia. But the geography of Russia will now reassert itself. Asia begins from the Urals and traverses across more than 5,000 kilometers to the Sakhalin Islands in the Northeast Asia. From Mount Narodnaya and Yekaterinburg and Salekhard right up to Vladivostok and Siberia. Actually, 77% of Russia is in Asia. The demographics, of course, are a reverse mirror, as is development. So Asia provides the natural resources, Europe consumes it. But that has been the story of imperialism all through. The quote that I was referring to was Xi Jinping just before he left the Kremlin on Tuesday, 21st March this year. That night, after a 2-day visit, he told Putin, quote, "Change is coming that hasn't happened in 100 years, and we are driving this change together." Now, I don't think a leader like Xi would make a remark just off the cuff or because he had nothing better to say. Right? That is the fault of some politicians, but not, I think, part of his character. The two smiled, they clasped hands. Putin replied, "I agree." Xi's last words before he stepped into the limousine were, "Please take care, dear friend." Xi understood the dangers of change. But one difference Xi never mentioned, that he was now at the wheel, while Putin was standing in the front lines. The driver of change was no longer the superpower of the 20th century. He left this unsaid, but he didn't. Very soon his actions since then, right, and before then, have in a rush proved that Russia now is a secondary partner. The term that Xi used was a limitless partnership. I would beg to submit that the term limitless partnership was a diplomatic fudge. Neither is it limitless, nor is it going to be much of a partnership. Because the reality of Asia and the reality of what China needs is not going to permit the sustainability or even the existence of this partnership. Now let's turn our perspective west. It is common, I reveal nothing very dramatic when I say that the West has decided to fund and arm Ukraine, as has been cynically said, by one Western general, as that, we will fight till the last Ukrainian. So it is basically they are funding it because on the principle that they were bled in Vietnam. In a similar way, right? Can we bleed Russian power out of Europe? To weaken Russia in Europe till it is beyond recovery for the foreseeable future. This thinking is a basic, fundamental miscalculation. And I say this, I repeat it, that if this is the West's rationale for funding Ukraine and this war, it is a deep historic miscalculation. Why? Because apply some common sense. You cannot weaken Russia in a region where it is already weak. Russia lost Europe in 1990. It is not strong in Europe anymore. All it is trying to do in Europe, as I said, is to find a defensive line. What is it going to be? It's new Maginot Line, or you call it whichever line you like. So that is the signal, not of a person who's advancing, but of a person saying, you've come to my doorstep. Now let me tell you that this is my final doorstep. Ukraine is my final doorstep. You can't weaken Russia in Europe because it is not strong. On the other hand, you can weaken Russia where it is strong, which is Central Asia and Northeast Asia. When we say Central Asia, yes, but we forget that the vital struggle is going to be for Northeast Asia. I will explain in a little while why. And this is now, if you look what is happening, we are looking at it from the perspective of Delhi or Bengaluru or, wherever we are. But if you look at this phenomenon from the perspective of Bishkek, capital of Kyrgyzstan, look at it from Dushanbe, capital of Tajikistan, look at it from Tashkent, right? Look at it from Kazakhstan. Then what do you see? Here is the great Russian bear, right? Even after it was loosened its grip in Europe, it was still permitted by world acquiescence to control this vast region from Pamir right up to, the Caucasus. Right? So I am looking at what Kremlin is doing, and I come to the conclusion that if the control, let's say from Delhi or from, Bangalore, if the control of Chanakya University is proving so costly for the regime headquartered in Bangalore, how on earth is it going to threaten or conquer Kerala? So if Russia is making such a meal out of imposing its will in Ukraine, how can it conquer or keep its zone of influence in Central Asia or indeed in Northeast Asia? Now, who will fill that vacuum? The countries of that region, East Asia in any case is part of, the only power that can fill that vacuum is China. And the Chinese will fill that vacuum for two reasons. One, because it fits in neatly with its map of despair, I think. That is what it's called. In the map of despair, at the year in which it lost Hong Kong, the Qing dynasty, that very year they created a map of China, which included what they would call the power of China, the empire of China, which merged very, very surreptitiously into the geography of China. Map of empire and the geography of China were correlated. Because when you think of China, always ask yourself some, curiously common questions. Like if China really extended right up to Turkmenistan, look at the map and see how much distance is there. Why would the Chinese build their wall next to Beijing? You only build a wall on your frontiers. So they built a wall along the natural frontiers. The rest is acquisition. Tibet, Mongolia, right, the old Tatar countries. I've actually a list of things which I can prove that have happened in the last year where the Central Asians have reacted. Well, let me give you one or two, otherwise, President Kasim Jomart Jakayev of Kazakhstan, who actually owes his survival to Putin, reflected the new confidence of the Central Asian countries, which now believe that Russian presence is there, but Russian hegemony is over. Right? He refused to support Moscow on Ukraine at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in June 2022. He also refused to support Moscow at the United Nations General Assembly last September. He was responding to his own public sentiment, which sees this that as implicit liberation. Nobody wants a return of the Soviet Union. Right? So this is the opportunity. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan abstained from voting along with India and China on the UN resolution of February 2023, 1 year after which condemned the Russian invasion. They refused to support. Normally, they would have joined the 6 or 7 countries which supported the Russian. Incidentally, all the 5 nations have placed orders for Turkish drones. Which, by the way, cost only $2,000 or something. They don't cost. China, sitting calmly in the waiting room of superpowers, Xi Jinping held the second Central Asia summit at Xi'an, Xi'an, capital of the Han dynasty, so deliberately chosen. Between 2006 and 2020 AD, in May this year, he called it the highlight of the year's diplomatic calendar and offered development at friendly rates. So, construction is already underway for a new Kyrgyzstan-China road. I've called this now the dragon butterfly effect. You know about the butterfly effect. This one is the dragon butterfly. For the moment, America has kept Moscow and Beijing in step lock. It's very simple. Moscow is waiting for America to become weak and America to weaken Russia. Only then will it make its next strategic moves. On the other hand, it already sees a perception of weakness and has begun this. I'll explain to you. This has set in motion the dragon butterfly effect. The wings of this species of butterfly found in Southeast Asia flutter to the timbre of Chinese music. China seems intent now on drawing a new strategic map of Asia. And therefore I've called it, really the next war will be the war for Asia. With one axis on a line which connects Beijing with Riyadh, I am absolutely sure people here were as stunned as the Americans were when the Saudis leapt out of Western control and suddenly China was able to broker a deal which actually ended, I think, decades of American policy, which is the rapprochement between Iran and Saudis. Since the Iranian Revolution, this has been the basis, right? And in a second curve, now this is more interesting. From the Gulf, this axis has moved because of Iran to Syria. Haven't you read that Assad, who was completely, not only sidelined, he was not recognized, he was not part of the Arab League, has suddenly been reinducted just in the last few weeks, last few months. The Beijing-Riyadh equation is being reinforced by unprecedented levels of investment. In June 2023, right, just now, China and the Gulf Cooperation Council ended a 2-day Arab-China business confabulation with an announcement of over 30 agreements worth over $10 billion. Now, these are practical points of cooperation. It is only one indicator of the mood of the times. The overt purpose included the wish to rewrite the rules of the energy market. That's the important. That's the nodal point. And create new models of collaboration. Simple translation, to find an alternative to the dollar. That now is a work heavily in progress in many ways, because many countries, including us, we are paying for Russian oil in the yuan. Let's keep that a secret. Right? Riyadh Declaration promised partnership in renewable energy, digital economy, artificial intelligence, cyber security, and the industrial internet, which means the very basis. The very basis. This is the framework of future development. What else? Is there anything left, Mon? Yeah. I don't know how many of you know, all in the papers, all public knowledge, that China now has proposed a peace plan for Palestine. Major diplomatic step. It's not easy. Nothing is ever going to be easy. But it has done so. Following this, Mahmoud Abbas has already been to Beijing. Once again, you may say, okay, more of the same. But now let me tell you the twist. Benjamin Netanyahu has announced he is going to Beijing. And he is going to Beijing to discuss this. It may not happen, but you can see how China's diplomatic zone of influence is literally expanding at a furious rate. One of the China's, I think, parallel objectives is the isolation of India in Asia. And if this axis holds, I mean, obviously we are making our efforts. On Monday, a very important Saudi dignitary will be in Delhi for 5 days. We are doing the things we should have done a little earlier. This effort at the isolation of India and Southeast Asia, they don't consider really as strategically independent. But India has the capacity to be not only strategic, but to be a leader of alternatives. This isolation effort is going to keep huge pace, which will demand every nerve of our capability to challenge and reverse. They create a Red Sea economy, and a Red Sea economy which will then work in collaboration with this Red Sea economy is part of MBS's, Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030. And, if Iran is on this strategic deal, then the problem of Hezbollah is also sorted out. Because Hezbollah is basically an Iranian construct. Turkey is still an outlier. They haven't come to a full understanding of how to deal with Turkey, because Turkey is a natural rising power. And it will not easily bend its own interests for either the Chinese or for the Saudis. So it's still an outlier. But the access up to Moscow has now very clearly and well defined. India and the Gulf, of course, have a very old and very important, not only people to people, but economic ties, bridges, which will be our bulwark as we seek our foreign policy. So we have assets too, great assets. Now to the map of shame. This was the map I was referring to. This is the Qing map of the Qing dynasty. First drawn, the Qing dynasty was destroyed 1911 by Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionaries. The first thing Sun Yat-sen reaffirmed was the Qing map. Empire may have gone, but this is part of China's national objectives. Sun Yat-sen replaced by Chiang Kai-shek. In 1938, the Chiang Kai-shek government published a map of shame, showing areas that were seized by Russia, Japan, and the European colonial powers. These included the Russian Far East, Japan's Senkaku and Nansei chain of islands. This is well known. Taiwan, of course, but Korea, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malay Peninsula, Singapore, Myanmar, Nepal, Kashmir, naturally the whole of it, and huge swaths of Central Asia. They were either considered direct parts of the empire or tributary states. So this is, and where the shame, because China had lost it. 8 decades later, the lines of ambition are not as blurred as one might imagine. They get much clearer when they coincide with contemporary interests and seismic shifts in international power equation in a time of volatile change. Eventually, remember that the Japanese Empire began with the defeat of Russia in 1905, the naval defeat that inspired Japan. China would wake Ukraine into the sauce of its revival. Because once Russia is weakened, then the only force that can check China. We are south of the Himalaya. Vis-a-vis India, actually the only thing I foresee is, I'll come to something later, which is China will never attack never attack Taiwan. Never. And try and explain why. The only state with which it might be tempted to go with war is India. And it will be not a war of too much or too extensive an occupation of space, because the Chinese supply lines can only stretch so far. Right? It will be a war of, quote unquote, teach them a lesson war and slap India down so that its morale is broken for another 20, 30 years. In this respect, the Chinese will make the miscalculation that Russia has made in Ukraine. Right? Here is the latest Chinese description of how strategic thinking is evolving. You know about Wang Yi, he was removed from foreign minister and sent to somewhere a sinecure place, but he's still influential. He's the director of Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee for Foreign Affairs Commission. In January 2023, this year, he tells Japan and South Korea to foster, quote unquote, strategic autonomy with Beijing and revitalize Asia as a counterpoint to the West. See, here is now the dream of Asia as a counterpoint to the West. Speaking at a trilateral forum in Qingdao, he said, quote, "No matter how blonde you dye your hair, how sharp you shape your nose, you can never become a European or American. You can never become a Westerner. We must know where our roots lie." He told the two, Japan and Korea, right? To end the coercion of bullying and hegemony by America, of course. Beijing is pushing the East-West narrative. Now, where does India stand in the Chinese mindset? This was defined by Mao.
Wow.
Who called India the running dog of imperialism. So, China doesn't ever believe that India can be an independent strategic power. And it has based all its calculations. And everything that happens, if the Prime Minister Modi goes to Washington, then it confirms this. Right? When when Xi goes to Washington, of course he is independent. But if Prime Minister Modi goes, then he is dependent. But that is the way the Chinese have constructed. I tell you, the attempts at isolation are getting very relevant. Last week was the SEO. India was the only country which did not sign the Economic Development Strategy 2030 agreement. Now, we are the host. The interesting part is not that we signed, but that everyone else signed. Right? So the politics and the diplomacy of isolation is being pursued Why seriously and systematically? And it includes Russia, which signed. So, on the other hand, when the Danes called for a conference on Ukraine and invited us, just again in June, a few weeks ago, because we were invited, the Chinese didn't go. I really don't know how much more time I have. But, I think American policy is really becoming yet another manifestation of what Condoleezza Rice has called the creative chaos theory. That instead of policy, you can have creative chaos. You can export chaos and get your means. Doesn't work. America, I believe, now please ask Uncle Google and tell me if I'm wrong. But I've last learned that it has over 800 military bases. Right? You cannot have 800 military bases but not have the capacity to put 800 troops on the ground. If you can't involve infantry, the maximum that the Americans are ready to go, as they have gone in Ukraine, is to swarm Kyiv with CIA agents. So all the intelligence and some, which is an important part of war. It's an extremely important part of war. So that is being... China is developing skills in what I call grey zone warfare, or what is known as grey zone warfare. Change facts on the ground without intervention, as far as you can. However, this game of matchsticks and sulfur does not work unless the puppeteer has reinforced its military muscle. So China cannot play this game with reinforced military muscle, because any miscalculation would trigger a flashpoint. And if you're not able to deal with the flashpoint, all your efforts, you've gone back. In snakes and ladders, you've gone back to the start. This is the biggest snake which has swallowed you. And therefore, I will take two quotes from Xi. 1 week after his third term, he addressed the PLA and said, China's standing army of 2 million must turn into a great wall of steel. And he has reinforced this message over and over again. In 2 years, China will have 400 ships against America's 300 minus. China's defense spending in 2023 will be 225 billion. I know this is much less than America's 842 billion, but America has a much larger canvas. China is restricting its canvas. So as a per capita or per nautical mile spending is very high. China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, he showed no hesitation, right? When he told his first conference, then he told that he warned of conflict with the United States. Xi, more recently, has told his armed forces to be prepared to fight high roads, rough waves, and perilous stormy seas, each one a battlefield its own. The high roads are the Himalayas. That's rough seas, the South China. Okay. The grey zone warfare, what it is its ultimate ambition. The whole world is talking about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It will not happen, because Xi will not invade a part of China. Please understand, for him, Taiwan is not a separate country. The people of Taiwan are Chinese people. He cannot save face, which is very important, by invading his own people. Invasion will be a signal definition of his failure, not his success. He would like some form of a Hong Kong variation solution. But let me tell you how you can use belligerence to achieve the same motive. And here is, well, you might call it speculation, but I believe it's a very, very possible war game. When you have a strategic department, play this war game at Chanakya. Beijing will take on America not in order to seize Taiwan, but in order to protect Taiwan from American invasion. That will be his rationale. So as the American Navy nears or is there, he can throw a blockade. Remember Cuba? Once he throws a blockade, what do the Americans do? Do they run the gauntlet and break the blockade? Because the blockade is not going to impact the mainland. The mainland will already have got its supplies. The blockade is unfortunately going to impact Mon, because semiconductors will stop. America, everyone else. How long will you last? On the diplomatic table, what does Beijing have to say? He can come to Delhi also and say that what is your problem, we don't understand. Why are you against the blockade? You accepted that Taiwan was a part of China in 1952. So I'm only defending my country. By your definition, it is part of my country. Why should, if tomorrow India wants to put a blockade around Goa, shall I object? It is Indian territory. It is up to India. If Portuguese still want to send a navy in Indians, you go ahead and do it. We'll support you. This is where, in such a confrontation, the day America withdraws, American power is over. So, these are the Asian consequences of the Ukraine war. You can see the pattern building and pattern being created. Right? You can see that the casus belli has been set and thought through. Where does this take us? Before we go anywhere, I just want to end with one thing which I'm looking for, which is, yes, I'm not going to go into the size of the economies because it's all right. I just want to take one fact. Where is the real secondary confrontation in Asia going to take place? I hinted this before. It is when the interests of Russia and China clash. In 1969, in the 60s, we remember 62, we don't remember 69. Mao sent troops to the border at Manchuria. A war between the Russians and the Chinese was fought for 6 months across a range of battlefields. Right? Why? China believes, and it has some justification because this is all Tsarist aggression, that 350,000 square miles of Chinese territory were taken by the Russians in the 19th century. Now, Russia colonized Siberia in the 16th century. After the conquest of Kazan, he took it from the Mongols, but then they've absorbed the Mongols. The Mongols after Genghis, of course. The Khanate of Sibir evolved into Turko-Mongol territory of Tatars, the most northern Muslim state after the conversion of Tatars to Islam from shamanism. What is the battle for? Resources. Siberia is over 13 million square kilometers. It has vast resources of oil. All the oil that we are buying from Russia is actually from the east. It's not from the west. With its vast of oil, natural gas, hydropower, coal, copper, timber, lead, zinc, bauxite, nickel, tin, mercury, platinum, titanium, manganese, potash, uranium, cobalt, tungsten, aluminium, mica, amber, iron ore, tobacco, gold, and diamonds. And this may not be a complete list. The Western Siberian basin is, at least at the time of writing, the largest known hydrocarbon basin with reserves of 146 billion barrels of oil and 1600 trillion cubic feet of gas. It contains 107 giant fields with 9 discovered since 2019, when Russia was producing 11.5 million barrels a day. Right, as I said, the point made. Now let's carry on. Otherwise, you can go for 10 minutes on this. And this is what will create this. Will Russia be able to protect Siberia and East Asia after Ukraine? It will get at least much of what it wants in Ukraine because it's too close. Everything needs a closure. But in Asia, I think the story of Russian Asia is the story that should occupy some serious minds, get some serious thinking involved, because we are directly or indirectly affected by what happens. The next war for the world will be the war for Asia. And I think if you examine things carefully, both sides have begun to strengthen their options, because once a conflict becomes part of the discourse, a conflict also becomes part of history, a part of reality. Thank you very much.
I would take that standing ovation to sir, please, everybody. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I think beyond the patterns, we also want to now seek your inputs and address our young scholars and researchers who are here about the linking the theory and the practice, because in the theoretical components that they get exposed to, they are also eager to know how it gets reflected in practice. So now we'll open up for interaction with Shri M. J. Akbar, sir.
Very, I don't know the words to say, really mind-boggling talk. Thanks for that. Thanks for coming to Bangalore and giving such a wonderful talk. My question straight is, the West and US dependence on China's manufacturing sector, and they are in very hopeless situation. And China can exploit anything, instead of going into any of the direct war situation, because they are having so much of economic clout through their manufacturing thing. What's your thoughts on China's control on manufacturing sector and its influence in Europe and US?
It is very good question. It is a very good question because, but inbuilt into the question is a misconception that nations believe or can be led to, persuaded to believe, to forego their natural geographical destiny through other means. That has not happened. Otherwise there would be no wars. Wars have been a correction of perceived injustice. You were strong in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and you took what belonged to China's development. Right? We have not forgiven the English for having partitioned us. At least I have not. I don't know about you. Right? So, because it is part of India's geographical hinterland. Right? It is what might be called natural India. Partition was a wound with all sorts of consequences. This doesn't mean that we do not recognize, or I do not recognize, the sovereignty of Pakistan. As I said once when this question is, when India and Pakistan meet, they meet as sovereign nations. So that debate is end. But yet, the historical wound is there. So, Chinese have very, very strong sense of their historical narrative. And that will impel their policy much further than we think.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Kritika. So my question is, we have seen, just now we heard that if there will be a domino effect of the war in Asia. So any war will have a domino effect. So can we expect such kind of a domino effect in Asia? And is it far-reaching to say that India can play a mediator while that kind of a domino effect happens?
The domino effect was a limited effect. The tiles would fall upon basically weaker nations. That was the Vietnam syndrome that you're talking about. Here it is not a domino effect. Here is a seismic effect. So the earth is trembling. And the tremors of the earth go back to their roots, arousing other fissures. Therefore, this is far more dangerous, and therefore leads. Then my thesis is that the next war is going to be the war for Asia, because Asia's ability to lead the world to greater levels of prosperity is far higher than Europe's abilities. It is something that they have not, they don't talk about. But the whole history, apart from 200 years of colonial, 300 years of colonial, 1750 figures you see from Yale University, you will know that India and China produce 1/4 of the world's goods. Or half of the world's goods, sorry. So it will happen again. But it will require India and China to find equilibrium.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm Gauri, and my question is more towards the internal security aspect of it. The recent Wagner Group coup in Russia for sure raises some questions on internal security of such a vast nation. So my question related to India about that is, given India faces such a situation, how well are we equipped strategically and diplomatically that we will come out of such a coup sort of a situation easily, or what is it going to turn out for India to be like? Thank you.
One of the great things about India's defense policy, which is very, very, very important, and it has really, among the remarkable things that the Prime Minister has done, is to bring a lot of stability, quiet stability into our defense thinking as well. Right? Then if I had to define it quickly, I would say when we say that we have a defense ministry, we are very clear that it is a defense ministry, not an offense ministry. Okay? Other countries do not necessarily have the same, they are more flexible in their approach to defense and offense. But we are very clear. We have had almost historical rights to some areas where we could have taken the offensive. We have not. We have always believed that the best solution to conflict resolution is dialogue. On the other hand, what is very clear now is that India has introduced accountability into its defense strategy. So if any Indian is hit, single Indian is hit, there will be accountability. And we will use our defense forces to Pulwama. There shall be accountability. Right? But it doesn't mean war. Balakot doesn't mean war. Right? It is just a message. Know your limits. Now, therefore, we do not need. Wagner Group is a phenomenon that was first seen in Iraq. So this creation, moment you become a nervous power, then you no longer have the confidence to trust your own army. Because your army now doesn't want to fight in body bags. Same situation. So you hire mercenaries. Did it in Iraq. Didn't work. No mercenary force will ever replace a national force in terms of patriotism. When your motive is money, not the flag, then...
Namaste, Mr. Akbar. Thank you so much for this particular topic, to you and Chanakya for choosing this particular topic. I don't think we speak about the Asian consequences as much. We get a very westernized perspective. My question is about the grey zone warfare that you spoke about, which is,
how susceptible, and in what are the susceptibilities within India to the grey zone warfare which China is clearly speaking about? My name is Surabhi Hodhigare. Forgot to mention.
Very good question, and I'm glad you actually. But you can see, we have to please this audience more than anyone else. You must have a total consciousness of India's geography. We don't. Frankly, we don't see Andaman really as a part of India. I have to go everywhere and say that, we are only 50 miles from Indonesia. And nobody really believes it, but it's true. Some of the most important investments that are taking place now are taking place there, because it's a part of India. Right? Our natural border, our natural neighbor is Indonesia. In any case, I remember proposing, and then it has gone to some effect, that we have to redefine the meaning of neighbor. A neighbor is not defined by geography, it's defined by reach. If I can't reach a neighbor, that land is not a neighbor. There are 1,000 flights today to the Gulf. Each one is packed every weekend. Each one is packed. You can't find a seat. There is one particular country, there is not a single flight. So who is my neighbor? The Gulf is my neighbor, not this country. This country is an accidental obstacle.
You leaving it in the Just saying.
Right? There are 12 flights a day to Bangladesh. That's my neighbor. Go to Petropol when you go east and you see how a civilized border functions. You walk there in 20 minutes, somebody's files, talk to, gone. People coming in, same. That's how civilized people behave. You don't remain frozen with theatrics at the end of the day. So here, I think the Indian ability, to has institutionally protected itself in a very fine, sophisticated and disciplined manner from the rogue element.
My name is Krishna. I'm a chartered accountant. Just a couple of points. You spoke about strategic autonomy. In a way, when we had strategic autonomy, we really didn't matter on the world stage because we were not really powerful economies. We were not trading. If we draw parallels between what China is doing today versus what the US did for a long time, until the First World War, the US quietly developed, became an economic superpower. And China is kind of doing the same thing. So many Asian conflicts, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq. China, although geographically could have been a major part of it, they sat out, they developed their economy, and 50 years later, they're really flexing their muscles. In a way, if you look at it, India possibly is 30, 40 years behind. We keep saying our time has come, we can lead the world. But if you look at it both from a political, economic, and a systems perspective, I feel we are about 30, 40 years away and we should bide our time, build our country. Is there some thinking like that sort in the Indian polity?
I'm afraid that is an extremely timid way to approach India and its policies. And I thought we had at least left timidity behind. When we were given independence, right? I'm sure you will say next that we were given independence. There you are, you said yes, we were never given independence. We took it. We fought for it. And that is a flaw in your argument. When we were nothing, economically, we were ravaged by millions of deaths of by famine. This land. There are pictures from 1880s of Tamil Nadu. Please stop your accountancy and see those pictures. I'm sorry, I don't confuse this with anger. It's not anger. But see, we had exercised strategic autonomy even in 47. The will to defend your home is as strong in a hut as it is in a palace. Every hut wants to become a palace. And we cannot and will not be denied the right to make the palace. But we will not do it at the cost of surrender. And I'm saying China also didn't do it. China had the liberty of dictatorship.
The word out for leading the world at was.
What leading the world? First you have to find the strength. And we had our thinking has greater influence today than I think 80%, 90% of the countries of the world. Do you think that the world welcomes our Prime Minister because it is sentimental? There is no sentiment. It is recognition of India's capability and India's potential. And that recognition is at you. We will hit critical mass. The journey from negligible to $1 trillion GDP was long. From 1 to 2 was long. From 2 to 4 is much shorter. From 4 to 15 is geometric progression, not arithmetical progression. So it will happen. If it doesn't happen in my lifetime, it will happen in yours. Your future is safe.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Ali Kali, Sisimwange Ali from DR Congo. I am representing the Federation of International Student Association, Bangalore Fezabi. Coming to the topic of the day, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very important, I think, for all of us. Now, coming to the Asian consequences of the war in Europe, especially Ukraine, I wanted to talk more on a perspective of the world order and the Western, but also NATO. One of the strategies, I'm pretty sure you will agree with me, that the Western has been using is to divide for other countries, for example, African countries and Asian countries, in order to rule. But are Asian countries today aware of their roles and responsibilities in the world, but also the role that unity plays among the countries of the same continent in order to, to also control the world in one way or the other, especially when we talk about autonomy in terms of strategy. For example, India today has so much potential on an international level. When we look at China as well, it's a very powerful country. One thing that we've noticed, for example, with Western countries is whenever there is something where they have to come together, despite the differences, they come together to make a decision accordingly. But is it something that Asian countries also do on issues that matters the most, to come together and make a decision which is beneficial for the continent? Is this something, for example, when we talk in perspective of Africa as well, that African countries can come together on issues that matter and put their differences aside in order to make a decision beneficial for them?
Right. We raised some good points there. First, I must say that one of the most marvelous sights I have seen is the river in Congo. It is what a powerful river. And I tell you that countries which are blessed with rivers, they create a different consciousness. We are a river country, right? Egypt is a river country, right? You have a mother river also. It's very, actually nothing as dramatic and as moving as the flow of a river, particularly one as powerful as yours, right? But the question of unity cannot precede the question of creating a national interest, right? National interest must harmonize. The problem arises because history and colonialism, right? Of course, please understand one thing. After 75, we can't keep blaming the British for everything. Right? It's time it's over. It's over, finished. But however, since this question has been raised, and because we see it in our context, that's where we see evidence of both sides. We see evidence today of India and Bangladesh. We see evidence of India and Sri Lanka. We see evidence of India and Nepal. We see evidence of India and Maldives. We see of India evidence of unity coming to each other's help. Despite the tensions of history. Right? With every country, apart from one. Because that country has been trapped. I may venture to say that this is one country. There are lots of countries in the world which have been created for Muslims. Pakistan is not the only one. Pakistan was not created for Muslims. Pakistan was created for absence of Hindus. It's a very different phenomenon. So basically it was created out of violence, anger, right, and forms of imagined revenge. It's terrifying. I never confuse Pakistan with Pakistanis. They are very nice people and so on, as nice as all of us. But the tragedy of that country is that it is born from a seed which is basically arid. So the only instance we have in our region, do you know that in the last 3 months, we don't have a formal relationship with the Taliban. We don't agree with what they represent. We don't agree. I think one of the most degrading things they have done is what they have done in the name of gender. We believe we want to be a modern nation. And you cannot be a modern nation without complete gender emancipation. It's not possible. Right? Every old notion has to go. But the problem here, I was telling Afghanistan, do you know that in the last few months, we have sent 60,000 metric tons of wheat as a gift. That's how you build harmony. You build harmony despite differences. Why punish the Afghan people for the noxious behavior of its government? We would have done the same thing, everyone. And Afghans are Muslims. We would have had the same attitude to everyone. But for what I would call a colonial obstacle that has been kept in our midst. So I think sometimes, like a river, you must learn to circumvent the problem, not override it.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Khushi. Wonderful talk, by the way. It was very eye-opening. My question is that why does the media, or we, portray the Russia-Ukraine war as a war and the other situations as a Palestine conflict or Afghan disagreement? Do we morally believe that some lives are more important than others, or is it just we give priority because of the global impact? Thank you.
Not a good question, because it reminded me of a question I asked in the White House many moons ago. This was when, and I hope in this anecdote you will find the answer. So Vajpayee ji was in a state visit. So the same thing happened, which is par for the course, and you are allowed, every side is allowed 3 questions. And George Bush was there, and for suddenly out of the blue, somebody said that, asked me, I was with the media, that you have been asked to ask the question. So I looked at the Honorable George Bush, and I said, you know, when you have a terrorist attack, as happened, which is a huge tragedy, a wound across the world, if you like. You fly 7,000 or 8,000 kilometers, or 10,000 kilometers, bomb that country to smithereens, take over, they change, destroy the government, right? And all of it is fine. Have you heard anyone criticizing it? But when we get a terrorist attack, you always advise patience. Is it because an Indian life is less precious than an American life? I must say, to the credit of George Bush, he gave a very intelligent answer, which was, oh, this plan is moving at this speed. He answered everything but the question, which is a very political thing to do. But that is the truth of what happens. You have described the truth of what happens in your question.
My name is Ganesh. Just have one question based on what you have said.
Can you hold the mic closer to your mouth?
If China is looking to isolate India, what is the relevance of BRICS now?
Just because there are tensions within the United Nations, you don't disband the United Nations. Just because the Security Council has disagreements, you don't abandon a platform because because there are differences on the platform. That's what's it. I don't think anything. BRICS will grow.
Namaste, sir. I'm Gargi from Chanakya University. Thank you for that insightful lecture. Sir, my question is that China is usually looked at as a belligerent nation, someone who bullies smaller nations and who is aggressively pursuing for a great power status, if not global power. So one of the qualities of a great power is how other countries perceive it. So do you think China is actively trying to showcase its system shaping capabilities by brokering peace deals? First it happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now, as you mentioned in your today's lecture, between Israel and Palestine. Do you think China will be successful in this diplomatic tactic of theirs? Thank you.
I don't think China is trying to sell its system, because its system will not work anywhere else. The Chinese communism is more Chinese than communist. So, as far as it being able to broker peace, what we really should look at is not China whether it succeeds or not. It's not easy to succeed. But how many countries are willing to accept China as a broker? That's the change. 15 years ago, who was willing to? 10 years ago, who was willing to? So that is the change we have to recognize, we have to factor it in, and we have to deal with it in the civilized ways of diplomacy, which includes thinking before you say anything.
Thank you, sir. I think the interaction will continue, I'm sure, through your social media handle, because a lot of questions are there amongst the participants. I'm sure you will have to engage with that. Formally, we will conclude the presentation by sir and the talk that you have given to us, sir. And now I request Varsha to please hand over the memento to Amulya, who is representing through the Vice Chancellor, sir, through World Organization for Students and Youth. I request Vice Chancellor, sir, to hand over memento to Praveen, representing Knowledge, Innovation, Nationalism, which are popularly called as skin talks that we will be having. Sir, I would like to bring to your notice, 24 hours ago you had told us to move from bouquet to book. We have already implemented it.
Thank you.
Once again, I would request all of you to have a standing ovation to sir. Before we have a formal conclusion, request you to stay back, sir. We'll have Dr. Lovi to give vote of thanks. I request Dr. Lovi to please come.
Namaste. It gives me immense pleasure to extend my warmest gratitude for the wonderful talk given by Shri M.J. Akbar, former Minister of State for External Affairs. The talk itself spoke at length of the in-depth scholarship that Shri M.J. Akbar holds. There have been major and many takeaways from the talk on the Asian consequence of the European war in Ukraine, and I'm sure that our audience are benefited largely by the interaction that we had. I take this opportunity to thank the organizers, Chanakya University, Indian Institute of World Culture, WOSI and KIN for their support in organizing the event. I also thank Kumari Amulya from WOSI, Bangalore chapter, Shri Praveen Srinivas from KIN, our leadership team from Chanakya University, members of IIWC for their guidance and mentorship. Last but not the least, I would like to extend my gratitude to the media, branding and the technical team for their successful delivery of the program. Thank you.